कहीं से उड़ती उड़ती मुझे ये खबर मिली है कि आप लोगों से रीटेल लेक्चर के फ्रेजेस ही नहीं उठाए जा रहे हैं।
नहीं, मैं नहीं मानता।
देखो सिंपल सा लॉजिक है, किसी चीज़ को टाइम दोगे ना तो वो चीज़ होगी। इसीलिए आप लोगों के लिए वीडियो लेके आई हूँ। इसके अंदर टोटल 20 रीटेल लेक्चर की ऑडियोज़ आप लोगों के लिए प्ले करूँगी। हाथ में कॉपी और एक पेन होना बहुत ज़रूरी है अगर आप ये वीडियो देख रहे हो। एंड सिर्फ आपने कुछ नहीं करना, आपने सिर्फ फ्रेजेस नोट डाउन करने की कोशिश करनी है। फ्रेजेस का मतलब होता है 4 से 5 एक साथ आने वाले वर्ड्स जो आपको उठाने हैं। यूजुअली मैं स्टूडेंट्स को कहती हूँ कि आप 8 to 10 फ्रेजेस उठाने की कोशिश करो। स्टार्ट कर सकते हो 5 फ्रेजेस के साथ, या फिर स्टार्ट कर सकते हो सिर्फ 2 फ्रेजेस के साथ, फिर 5 के साथ एंड देन 8 to 10 फ्रेजेस के साथ। अगर एग्जाम में कोई ऐसी ऑडियो आ गई जो सिर्फ 40 सेकेंड्स की थी या फिर जिससे ज़्यादा कंटेंट आप नहीं उठा पाए, दैट्स फाइन। उस केस में आप रिपीट कर सकते हो, लेकिन कोशिश करने वालों की कभी हार नहीं होती है, मैं हमेशा अपनी वीडियोज़ में कहती हूँ। इस वीडियो में बैठो, 20 रीटेल लेक्चर कंपाइल किए गए हैं, उनको प्रैक्टिस करो सिर्फ बार बार लिखने की कि ऑडियो से कंटेंट किस तरीके से आप उठा सकते हो। वीडियो के एंड में मैं आपको एक रीटेल लेक्चर अपने अपडेटेड टेम्पलेट के साथ करके दिखाऊंगी, तो इस वीडियो को पहले एंड तक प्रैक्टिस करो एंड फिर मेरे सैम्पल आंसर को देखना कि किस तरीके से मैंने फ्रेजेस को नोट डाउन किया है एंड एक अपडेटेड टेम्पलेट के साथ अपने आंसर को बोल के दिखाया है। सो हियर यू गो विद द फर्स्ट रीटेल लेक्चर।
In today's lecture I'm going to talk about changes in air pollution since the middle of the last century and what has created these changes. So, by the 1950s, air pollution was very visible with frequent thick black fogs known as smogs in many large cities around the world. The main source of this pollution was from factories and it caused severe health problems. For example, a particularly severe smog in London in 1952 caused over 4,000 deaths. Obviously something had to be done, and in 1956 a Clean Air Act was introduced in Britain. This addressed the pollution from factories and the smogs soon disappeared. However, as you know, these days air pollution is still a big issue. The main difference between now and the 1950s is that you can't see it, it's invisible. Also, the main source of pollution now is from cars and lorries, and although these don't produce visible signs, this air pollution is still a significant risk to health. And one of the key factors in the rise of this type of pollution is that we have all become much more vehicle dependent. There are far more cars and lorries, trains and planes than in the 1950s, and this is now the main source of air pollution around the world. This is a bomb calorimeter. This is the actual piece of equipment that researchers used to calculate the energy content of either biodiesel or maybe even the potato chips that you had for lunch today. When they calculate the amount of energy, they're going to calculate it in heat units, which would either be joules or calories. I want you to look inside the bomb calorimeter. Inside here, you can see that there's a silver bucket. Water goes all in here, and this is actually the bomb, is the smaller silver cylinder. What you do is put your fuel sample in there, then these two electrodes are connected to the bomb. These provide the spark that will ignite your sample. When your sample burns or combusts, that gives off energy. So how is the energy collected, or how did a scientist figure out how much energy is being given off? Well, it's a closed system. There's a lid here that goes on top of this calorimeter, and what's in here in the lid is a stirrer. The stir is going to stir the water. That's in this big pool here, so that the heat given off from the sample is going to warm the water in a uniform way. This is the temperature probe. This goes down in the water also and measures the change in temperature because as the sample is burned, it will give off heat and the temperature the water will increase. So the lid goes on, the sample is prepared. The last thing that you need to make a combustion reaction happen is oxygen, and at some point during the process, some oxygen is added by a tank. That's connected to the calorimeter here. So we are going to burn a sample of the biodiesel that you've prepared and get some feedback on the energy content of it. You'll be able to use this to compare it to petroleum-based fuels like octane.
This is a kind of object that you're probably all familiar with when you had the term robot, but I'm gonna show you the very first robots. These were the very first robots. They were characters in a play in the 1920s called Rossum's Universal Robots, and the play was written by Czech writer called Karel Čapek. And basically, these robots, people tend to think of robots as kind of cute cuddly toys or, Hollywood depictions kind of devoid of politics. But the first robots were actually created and imagined in a time of absolute political turmoil. You just had the First World War, it finished, had a devastating impact across Europe, and so people are kind of reflecting on what does it mean to be human, what makes us human, those kinds of question. And this kind of context is what inspired Čapek to kind of write this play. And interestingly, these robots being human, they are actually in the play assembled on a production line, a bit like the Ford manufacturing production line. So even though they are human, they are assembled, and these robots are designed to labor, and that is their primary purpose in society.
I believe our borders should be open. But if that is not politically acceptable for now, Europe should at least open up a legal route for people from developing countries to come work here. Over time, hopefully, we can move to a position where borders are completely open. Persuading skeptics won't be easy. That's why I think the argument for free migration has to be made at several levels: a principled case, it increases freedom and reduces injustice; a humanitarian case, it helps people much poorer than ourselves; an economic case, it makes us richer; and a pragmatic case, it is inevitable, so it is in everyone's interests to make the best of it. Freedom of movement is not just a matter of human rights and international solidarity, it is in our self-interest. Opening our borders may seem unrealistic. But so too, once, did abolishing slavery or giving women the vote. Campaigning for people's right to move freely is a noble cause for our time.
Welcome to your very first tutorial in biology. Now, in this video series what I want to do is I want to talk to you guys about many different topics concerning biology. For example, I want to talk to you guys about DNA and genetics in cells, in bacteria, in life and a whole bunch of interesting stuff. But since this is the very first video, I think what we should do in this video is just stick with the very basics. And the first thing I want to do is talk to you guys about what is biology. So, let's go ahead and answer that question. And the definition of biology is this: the study of life in living organisms. Alright, that makes sense up to a certain point up until organisms, because you may have heard of organisms before. And you may have your own definition, but the scientific definition of an organism is a living thing. Well, that's easy. We know what living things are. I'm a living thing, plants, grass is a living thing. My puppy named Old Dan, cutest puppy ever, by the way, is a living thing. But whenever we talk about living things, believe it or not, things get rid of complicated, because then you have to ask yourself, what is life? Well, of course, if you ask your grandma or your best friend, or even if you ask a philosopher, what is life, everyone is going to give you kind of a different definition of their outlook on life. However, whenever scientists and biologists were first deciding, what is life? That's the problem, that they had everyone had their own separate definition of life itself. So, what they need to do before biology was even invented, which is, of course, the study of life, is scientists needed to agree on the definition of life.
Honeybees do a waggle dance to direct other bees to the source of nectar. The dancing bees like this one can be halted by a headbutt from another bee. Now research has found that this headbutt is actually a warning signal. A feeding station was set up in the lab to mimic the source of nectar, then foraging bees were introduced to the dangers at the station, such as competition from rival colonies. When foragers returned to the hive, they stopped bees dancing. Scientists think the behavior warns dancers of a dangerous source of nectar.
Thanks for this opportunity to speak about Australia's engagement with Asia from the perspective of trade, and in particular to say a few words about what trade is doing in this space. And I'm particularly pleased to be addressing trade and investment, not just of course because these two things are inextricably linked, but also of course because Australia reports to Australia's first ever Minister for Trade and Investment. Asia's importance to Australia's economy is growing by the day. It is one of the most important factors to consider when assessing the international conditions for national prosperity. Asian demand for our exports has helped Australia manage the global financial crisis better than most other developed economies. In fact, probably better than all other developed economies. An investment from Asia has added to the productive capacity of the economy and to overall productivity in 2013. 7 of our top 10 export markets were in Asia and represented 65% of our total exports. Asian markets and Australia's geographic proximity are critical not just for our trade ties and our capacity to access important global supply chains, but also to the level of foreign investment in Australia. FDI has grown markedly in Australia over the past decade. In fact, it has more than doubled from about $292 billion to $630 billion in 2013. Our civilization, which subsumes most of its predecessors, is a great ship steaming at speed into the future. It travels faster, further, and more laden than any before. We may not be able to foresee every reef and hazard, but by reading her compass bearing and headway, by understanding her design, her safety record, and the abilities of her crew, we can, I think, plot a wise course between the Narrows and bergs looming ahead. And I believe we must do this without delay, because there are too many shipwrecks behind us. The vessel we are now aboard is not merely the biggest of all time, it is also the only one left. The future of everything we have accomplished since our intelligence evolved will depend on the wisdom of our actions over the next few years. Like all creatures, humans have made their way in the world so far by trial and error. Unlike other creatures, we have a presence so colossal that error is a luxury we can no longer afford. The world has grown too small to forgive us any big mistakes. The biotech engineering has undergone 3 phases. In the first phase, people designed and made some simple machines, which aimed to help people understand ourselves. And first group of people that realized we could learn from ourselves were engineers. And then, based on the studies, people began to make complicated devices, in order to cure wounds, like the practice of suture, and to study physiology. This is the second phase. Later, since we went into the third phase, more complicated machines have been developed, like ECG, electrocardiography, able to have an insight of your internal body without intruding it, which can show the human brain's functions. X-ray is a good example. In an X-ray picture, you can see the bright area is the heart with some vessels around, and the dark area is the lungs. These devices benefit humans greatly in solving health problems, such as diseases. Let's say if I'm asking which source do you often use to get information? Newspaper, radio, and the survey shows 62% of the people chose internet. You might be thinking I am going to say how important the internet is, or how quickly it has changed the world for a few years. But what if I tell you this survey is conducted on the website globalandmail.com? Our answer will be different. Because the people who did this survey on a website must be frequent users of internet. This sample is a biased sample. So we have to pay attention to how a survey is conducted. Traffic light colors, red, amber and green, are used to indicate food's nutritional values according to the healthy standard. Different colors represent different food types, so that people can determine what to eat when they need some certain types of nutrient. The responsibility to label food properly on the packages is on the retailers. Thus consumers can be aware of food with less salt or less fat. This system makes it easier for consumer to make decisions. At the top, you would have a king. Now the king would rule over a kingdom. Now, this is not so easy to govern, especially during the Middle Ages. And the king might owe many people things, especially people who helped the king come to power, helped him depose the previous king or to conquer this land. And so in exchange for that and to help govern, he might grant land or feasts to other people. And the key currency in the Middle Ages under the feudal system is land. And land in exchange for loyalty and service. So this whole thing is a kingdom. Now right over here, this is a duchy. And the duchy will be controlled by a duke. I guess I didn't call it duchy because that just doesn't sound as serious. So the king might grant a duchy to a duke, and in exchange, the duke would provide loyalty pledged their fealty. If the kingdom is threatened, the duke will fight alongside. The king would provide their own troops if the king wants to go conquer other territories, same thing. And also provide the king with taxes, which might be in the form of coinage depending on what time and region we are in the Middle Ages, or it might be in the form of a percentage of the agricultural production from this duchy.
There is a picture, sort of artist's impression, before the space age of what Venus might be like on its surface, and so this was looking at the planet Venus. It was science fiction and science fact all the way up to 56 before the start of the space age, but it wasn't completely disproved. This idea of a really sort of lush environment on Venus until 1967, which is when the first measurements in detail were done at Venus. So Mariner 4 and Mariner 5 confirmed the feeling from an earlier space mission that in fact the surface of Venus was not like this at all, but extremely hot and also that the clouds were made of sulfuric acid, so there wasn't a nice water cycle like is going on in this picture, and so that it had to wait for these in situ measurements by spacecraft to actually do that, and so Venus turned out not to be quite as Earth-like as we thought, and I'll sort of tell you about some of the latest results from Venus Express, which they actually, there are some Earth-like features, but it's not like a
People forget things every day, including experiences, feelings, and thoughts. We call this process biological forgetting. Remembering is hard for people, and people try to overcome biological forgetting. Human memory is not fixed, but it can be reconstructed and shaped by the past. Since ancestors, we have always been trying to improve our memory.
Many parents communicate and educate their children with two languages, probably because they both know more than one language, or they come from different countries. Most of these parents think this can benefit their children's language learning. But actually kids will get confused when their parents use different languages from each other to describe the same object. If one parent sticks to one language, and the other one sticks to another language, their children will not be confused anymore.
But you can see from the relatively crooked and narrow streets of the city of Rome as they look from above today, You can see that again, the city grew in a fairly ad hoc way, as I mentioned. It wasn't planned all at once, it just grew up over time, beginning in the 8th century BC. Now this is interesting, because what we know about the Romans is when they left to their own devices and they could build the city from scratch, they didn't let it grow in an ad hoc way. They structured it in a very methodical way. That was basically based on military strategy and military planning. The Romans, they couldn't have conquered the world without obviously having a masterful military enterprise. And they were everywhere. They went on their various campaigns, their various military campaigns. They would build camps, and these camps were always laid out in a very geometrical plan along a grid, usually square or rectangular.
So the way a mother rat takes care of its pups is by licking and grooming, nipple switching and archback nursing. So the rats that do a lot of licking and grooming and they're last rats that rule very little. But most rats are in between. So that resembles a human behaviors as well, right? You have mothers that are highly mothering and mothers that couldn't care less, and most mothers are somewhere in between. So if you look at these rats, so all you observe them and put them in separate cages. So you put the high lickers in one cage, not the mothers, but the offspring and the low lickers in another cage, and then you let them grow and they're adults now, their mothers are long buried. And you look in the brain and you see that those who had high licking mothers express a lot of glucocorticoid receptor gene, and those who are low lickers express low. That reflects a number of factors and that results in a different stress response, but this is not the only difference. We found later on there are hundreds of genes that are differently expressed. So if you get in a mutation, polymorphism once in a million. Here, just the motherly launching just hundreds of genes in one shot, and it changes them in a very stable way that you can look at the old rat and you can say whether it was licked or not. But you can also save by behavior. So if you walk to the cages to the room, the rats that were poorly lit are highly anxious, hard to handle, aggressive, and the rats that were very well handled as off as little pups. They are much more relaxed, much easier to handle. So like every technician in the lab knows looking at the adult rat how it was licked when it was a little tough. Any question, of course, mechanism, how does this work?
Flipping a coin may not be the fairest way to settle disputes. About a decade ago, statistician Percy Diaconis started to wonder if the outcome of a coin flip really is just a matter of chance. He had Harvard University engineers build him a mechanical coin flipper. Diaconis, now at Stanford University, found that if a coin is launched exactly the same way, it lands exactly the same way. The randomness in a coin toss, it appears, is introduced by sloppy humans. Each human-generated flip has a different height and speed, and is caught at a different angle, giving different outcomes. But using high-speed cameras and equations, Diaconis and colleagues have now found that even though humans are largely unpredictable coin flippers, there's still a bias built in. If a coin starts out heads, it ends up heads when caught more often than it does tails. NPR's David Kessenbaum reports.
Deliberate practice takes time, and people also need to find and solve problems and mistakes during it. To be a high-performing solo musician for the violin, you also have to spend several dozen hundreds of hours in solitary practice. When it comes to other things, for example, studying geometry, it is still the case. During practice you should identify your weakness, focus on it, and carry out further deliberate practice to demonstrate how important deliberate practice is. Even for talents, they generally need spend 10 years to achieve the high international level of recognition. So there is no need for average people to be ashamed to practice. Happiness comes from frequency and quality of social relation. The higher the frequency is, the more happiness relations with friends and family and others produce. It is not sure why social relation is correlated with happiness. But there's evidence that when people feel more satisfied with their social relations, they will feel happier. In turn, when people feel happier, they will get more satisfied with social relations. Happy people tend to be social more with friends and have more interaction between family. Some people wonder if their social activities make them happier or their happy personalities drive them to be social more with their friends and families.
energized individuals but also transformed societies. Coffee is not just a drink. It's a global phenomenon that has shaped economic, social, and cultural landscapes. Coffee's journey from ancient Ethiopian fields to European coffee houses highlights its profound impact. In the 17th and 18th centuries, coffee houses in London and Paris became hubs for intellectual and social gatherings, influencing political and philosophical discourse. They were places where ideas flourished, fostering an environment of innovation and exchange. Moreover, the coffee trade has played a significant role in the global economy. It has been a major commodity in international trade, influencing economies of numerous countries, particularly in Latin America, Africa, and Asia. The industry has also evolved with ethical considerations like fair trade and sustainable farming gaining prominence. In conclusion, coffee's role extends beyond being a morning staple. It has been a catalyst for social interaction, economic development, and cultural exchange, demonstrating how a simple beverage can have far-reaching global influence.
अब जब मैंने इसमें रीटेल लेक्चर के फ्रेजेस को नोट डाउन किए तो आपने ऑब्जर्व किया होगा कि मैं कहीं पे भी रुकी नहीं थी. मुझे जो भी सुनाई दे रहा था मैं उसको कंटिन्यूसली नोट डाउन कर रही थी. जैसे ही मेरा फ्रेज नोट डाउन हो जाता था उससे नेक्स्ट जो भी उस ऑडियो में चलता था अगेन आई यूज्ड टू नोट डाउन. मैं अब आप लोगों को इसका एक सैम्पल आंसर बोल के दिखाती हूँ. द लेक्चर एनालाइज्ड अबाउट ट्रांसफॉर्मिंग द सोसाइटी एंड अ ग्लोबल phenomenon that has shaped the society. Firstly, the speaker mentioned about the profound impact in coffee houses in London. Further, the speaker explained about fostering an environment of information and exchange, Latin America, Africa, and Asia. So the speaker also talked about sustainable farming gaining prominence and beyond a morning staple. Overall, the lecture concluded about simple beverage can have a far-reaching global influence. तो इस तरीके से आप जो है अपना आंसर को 30 से 35 सेकंड्स के अंदर बोल सकते हैं. आई होप आपने इस वीडियो में अराउंड 20 रीटेल लेक्चर के फ्रेजेस को लिखने की प्रैक्टिस की होगी. थैंक यू सो मच एंड आई एम गोइंग टू कम अप विद मोर सच वीडियोस जिसकी वजह से आपको एक डेली पीटी प्रैक्टिस करने की हैबिट बन जाएगी. आई एम गोना सी यू इन द नेक्स्ट वन. बाय.